Venezuela challenges U.S. helicopter in the Caribbean, and it might have been a terrible mistake. An American military helicopter suddenly shows up 250 kilometers off Venezuela. On the other side, Maduro mobilizes 2,500 troops armed with combat drones on a secret Caribbean island. You won't believe what's happening in the Caribbean waters right now. We are one step away from witnessing the biggest military showdown in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the worst part, almost no one is talking about it. Get ready to uncover the truth behind this military escalation that could change everything in Latin America. It all started on what seemed like a regular Monday when a U.S. Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopter was picked up by civilian tracking systems exactly 250 kilometers off the Venezuelan coast. To give you an idea of how close that is, it's like a Brazilian military aircraft flying between Rio de Janeiro and Vitoria, technically in international waters, but close enough to cause a real diplomatic uproar. What's interesting is that Flight Radar 24 data confirmed the aircraft's presence, but Washington kept totally silent. Neither the State Department, nor Defense, nor even the Navy's Southern Command wanted to comment officially about the flight. That strategic silence from the Americans says way more than any official statement ever could. On the Venezuelan side, the response was immediate and firm. Nicolas Maduro's government called the reports fake news, a denial that sounds odd considering flight data is public and verifiable. It's like denying it's raining while everyone can see the drops falling. To grasp how serious this is, we need to dive into international maritime law. Venezuela, like any coastal nation, has clearly defined rights over its territorial waters. According to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, each country has full sovereignty over a 12 nautical mile strip, about 22 kilometers from its shore. But things get trickier when we talk about the exclusive economic zone, which stretches up to 200 nautical miles. In this zone, while the waters are technically international, Venezuela has exclusive rights over natural, fishing, and energy resources, including offshore oil. The American helicopter, flying 250 kilometers from the coast, was technically in international waters, but well inside this sensitive economic zone. It was a calculated move showing military muscle without technically breaking international law. An elegant provocation, but still a provocation. Venezuela didn't just sit by watching. Right after the incident, the country launched military drills on La Orquilla Island, a strategic position north of Venezuelan territory. The location was no coincidence. La Orquilla sits in a privileged spot in the Caribbean, basically a gateway for anyone wanting to control the region's maritime routes. Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez was crystal clear about the motive, a direct response to what he called Washington's threatening and vulgar voice. More than 2,500 Venezuelan troops were mobilized for the drills, including air defense systems with armed drones, surveillance drones, and unmanned submarines. What makes these drills particularly striking is the tech involved. We're talking electronic warfare, modern anti-air systems, and a display of military capability few expected from Venezuela. It was like the country saying, "You want to play this game? Let's play." But to fully understand this scenario, we need to rewind a few weeks. In August 2024, the U.S. deployed an impressive naval fleet to Caribbean waters. We're talking 3 guided missile destroyers and 3 amphibious ships carrying no fewer than 4,500 troops, including 2,200 Marines. Nicolas Maduro, never one for subtle diplomacy, warned about the presence of 8 American warships that he said were pointed at Venezuela. The Venezuelan leader even spoke of the risk of a continent-wide conflict if tensions kept escalating. This U.S. naval deployment didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of a broader strategy to pressure the Venezuelan regime, ramped up after the disputed July 2024 presidential elections, where Maduro claimed victory amid serious fraud allegations. Things escalated further when 2 Venezuelan military aircraft buzzed a U.S. Navy ship in international waters. The Pentagon called it a provocative action, but the episode revealed something key about Venezuela's strategy. They weren't just reacting, they were taking the initiative. These kinds of aerial confrontations over warships echo the tense days of the Cold War, when Americans and Soviets constantly tested each other's limits. The difference here is that now it's Venezuela versus the United States, a power gap that makes every move even riskier. What stands out is the guts of Venezuelan pilots getting that close to U.S. ships, knowing full well they're at a major military disadvantage. We can't ignore another crucial element in this equation: the fight against drug trafficking. The U.S. has been consistently using the anti-drug justification to explain its ramped-up military presence in the Caribbean. Recently, U.S. forces fired on Venezuelan vessels suspected of carrying narcotics. In one of those operations, U.S. forces took down what they called a suspected Venezuelan drug boat, but American authorities refused to say what exactly was on board. That lack of transparency feeds Venezuelan suspicions that the war on drugs is just a cover for spying and military intimidation. A U.S. Navy Seahawk helicopter recently seized over 588 kilograms of cocaine in international waters near South America. Legitimate anti-drug ops like these dangerously blur into geopolitical tensions, creating an environment where every action can be read as a military provocation. To fully grasp this escalation, we need to see the bigger picture. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, which alone explains much of the global interest in the country. Plus, its strategic location in the Caribbean makes it a key choke point for trade routes between North and South America. Maduro's government, isolated diplomatically and under heavy U.S. economic sanctions, has found willing partners in Russia and China to challenge American dominance in the region. This new alliance is reshaping the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere in a way Washington hasn't seen since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The presence of Russian military advisors in Venezuela, combined with Chinese investments in infrastructure, sets up a scenario where the U.S. feels compelled to respond militarily to keep its traditional influence in the region. One fascinating angle in this confrontation is the military tech involved. The U.S. MH-60 Seahawk helicopter is a versatile platform capable of anti-submarine missions, electronic warfare, and special operations. Its presence 250 kilometers off Venezuela wasn't just a recon flight, it was a power projection demo. On the Venezuelan side, the La Orquilla drills featured armed drones, air defense systems, and unmanned submarines. This mix suggests Venezuela is investing heavily in asymmetric military tech, gear that, while no match for U.S. firepower, could still inflict serious damage in a conflict. The electronic warfare element in Venezuela's drills is especially worrying, since it could jam U.S. comms and navigation systems without technically counting as an act of open hostility. This quiet standoff between the U.S. and Venezuela isn't happening in a vacuum. Brazil, for instance, is running its own Operation Atlas just 30 kilometers from the Venezuelan border, involving Army, Navy, and Air Force troops. While Brasilia insists it's unrelated to regional tensions, the timing is at the very least suspicious. Colombia, a traditional U.S. ally, is in a tough spot, sharing a long border with Venezuela and dealing with the fallout of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. More than 6 million Venezuelans have fled in recent years, making it Latin America's biggest migration crisis. Another often overlooked factor is how global public opinion views this showdown. While the U.S. tries to frame its actions as legit anti-drug ops and defense of democracy, Venezuela plays up anti-imperialist sentiment, still strong in Latin America. Venezuela's David versus Goliath narrative hits home in many countries with long memories of U.S. interventions in the region. That battle of narratives may be just as important as the actual military clashes, shaping future alliances and partnerships. What worries international analysts most is the risk of accidental escalation. When you've got military helicopters flying near sensitive zones, jets buzzing warships, and boats being fired upon, any misunderstanding can spiral out of control fast. History is full of conflicts that began with seemingly minor incidents. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was just a spark, but set off World War I. Nobody wants a misidentified helicopter or a malfunctioning drone to become the trigger for a regional war. The risks get even scarier when you realize both sides are operating advanced military tech in a relatively small geographic space. A Venezuelan air defense system could mistake a civilian plane for a military threat, or a U.S. commander could overreact to a routine approach. The line between a diplomatic incident and an act of hostility could come down to seconds of split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. Worse, the presence of Russian and Chinese allies in Venezuela means any escalation wouldn't stay limited to just two countries. It could pull global powers into a showdown nobody really wants, but one that could become inevitable given the dynamics in play. Looking at the strategies coldly, the U.S. seems to be applying a gradual pressure approach, what the military calls escalation dominance. The idea is to show such overwhelming superiority that the opponent is discouraged from any hostile move. Venezuela, for its part, is playing a game of symbolic resistance. Its military drills and aerial confrontations are less about real firepower and more about showing they won't be easily intimidated. It's a risky strategy that bets the U.S. isn't willing to pay the political price of direct military intervention. But behind all this military tension lies a brutal economic reality. U.S. sanctions have wrecked Venezuela's economy, which has shrunk over 75% since 2013. Venezuela's per capita GDP today is on par with developing African nations, a free fall for what was once South America's richest country. That economic collapse is both the cause and the goal of America's strategy. Washington is betting that economic isolation will eventually force regime change, while Maduro is betting he can hold out long enough for global geopolitics to swing in his favor. The irony is that the country with the largest oil reserves in the world is dealing with fuel shortages and frequent blackouts, a contradiction that perfectly sums up Venezuela's crisis. What we're seeing in the Caribbean is more than just a bilateral standoff. It's a microcosm of global tensions between established and rising powers, between unipolar and multipolar orders, between old hegemonies and new geopolitical alignments. That U.S. helicopter 250 kilometers off Venezuela wasn't just a military aircraft, it was a symbol of power projection across oceans. Those Venezuelan drills on La Orquilla weren't just military exercises, they were a declaration of national sovereignty against outside pressure. The question that remains is, how far is each side willing to go in this dangerous game where there are no clear winners, only increasingly unpredictable consequences? The world is watching because what happens in the turquoise waters of the Caribbean may very well shape the future of international relations in the Western Hemisphere. And in this geopolitical chess match, every move counts, every provocation carries weight, and every decision could be the difference between tense diplomacy and real conflict. History teaches us that big wars rarely start with formal declarations of hostility. They build slowly, fueled by misunderstandings, national pride, and miscalculated strategies. Let's hope leaders on both sides have learned those lessons, because the alternatives are far too dangerous to even think about.